Okay, Samantha has roots in Portland, Maine, northern New Englander. She was first introduced to disaster relief work as a volunteer following Hurricane Katrina. She's co-founder of the Disaster Researchers for Justice and the Center for Climate Adaptation Research, and the author of Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis. After her remarks, Dr. Montano will be joined by Southern Maine board member and a longtime Red Crosser, Jono Anzalone. Jono has served as a volunteer, a disaster program manager, wait for it, we're going up and up and up the ranks of the Red Cross, vice president of international services, and head of disaster and crisis prevention for the International Federation of the Red Cross in Panama. We're so fortunate to have you now on our board in Southern Maine. He earned his doctorate in education in 2020, researching volunteerism, and currently works as a university lecturer and Truman National Security Fellow. Jono has a few questions of Dr. Montano, and then we'll open up for conversation and Q&A from the audience. So get those questions ready when we do open the floor. Dr. Montano has also graciously agreed to sign books. So at the end of this event, out those doors to the left, there are books for purchase, and Samantha will be signing those, and you can get your own personal copy. Without further ado, Jono and Samantha, come on up. So you're going to work with this guy?
I got it. All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Happy to be here with all of you tonight. Thank you for letting me join you. So there is a lot going on in disaster world these days. These increased disasters, climate change, new kinds of things we need to be worried about like cybersecurity, and also a new political context that we're working in. And so all of these factors are coming together, and the field is changing a lot right now. And I give a lot of talks to various audiences who work in emergency management, who do disaster work. And over the past several months especially, a lot of those talks have been, let's kind of just talk through where we are right now, but also where we've been, how we got here, and where we want to go in the future. What is our vision for what disaster management looks like, disaster volunteerism? What does that look like as we move into this more disastrous world? So as you heard in my bio, I first got started doing disaster work in New Orleans, post-Katrina and the levee failure. I'm from Maine, and so I was very far removed from what had happened in New Orleans. I had like a vague sense from watching the news, but if any of you who've been here longer than 20 years were also in New Orleans, you'll know that actually going there, being in the city, seeing the extent of the destruction, the miles and miles of destroyed houses and mountainous debris piles, that it was something that you really can't imagine until you are there and you see it yourself. And that was really my first experience with disaster, so we jumped right into the thick of things. And so when I first went down, I just went for a week to volunteer with a group from my high school. We gutted some houses, started to do some rebuilding work, kind of the standard things that volunteers were doing after the flood. And pretty quickly, I realized the scope and scale of the need in New Orleans. It had been many months since the flood had happened, and although there were a ton of volunteers everywhere, New Orleanians were there working, government was getting it together and was helping, it wasn't enough, right? The scale of that need was just too big. And so I decided that at my first opportunity, I would move to New Orleans. So the second I graduated high school, moved to the city and started working on the recovery more long-term, right? Instead of just kind of parachuting in and leaving, I wanted to stay longer, to kind of become more engaged with the community and help with meeting those needs that existed throughout the city. And so I lived in New Orleans for a number of years, doing basically anything that needed to be done related to the recovery. So I worked with all different kinds of nonprofits, right? The big national, international groups that were there, like Habitat for Humanity, worked with the brand new groups that had formed in the city after the flood, groups whose names you would now recognize, like St. Bernard Project, SBP, but also smaller local ones like Common Ground. And then also the local nonprofits that had been in the city pre-Katrina, didn't have a disaster mission, but because of the severity of the need, had kind of expanded their role into doing these disaster tasks. And so I worked with a couple dozen of these groups over the years, sometimes as a volunteer, sometimes as an employee, sometimes as an intern. And it was a really interesting experience of being submerged really within the disaster nonprofit sector at a time where there was a lot of attention on how the city was being rebuilt and how the city was maintaining volunteers coming into the city into the long term, and what that looked like in various, differing parts of the city. And so I always say my real education on disasters came from those years in New Orleans. The other thing that I started to learn as I was doing all of this work is that recovery is really hard and it takes a really long time. And it's not always an equitable process, right? When you drove around the city of New Orleans, it was very clear that the whiter neighborhoods, the wealthier neighborhoods had been able to move through that recovery process more quickly. They still had their challenges, but were able to move through that more quickly. Whereas the poorer communities, the communities of color, were having a much more difficult time. Some people were not able to come back. And so through this kind of on-the-ground experience, started to think of how race and class and gender and all of these other bigger societal factors plays in not only to the actual response and the impacts that we see, but how that affects the recovery after and the mitigation and the preparedness work that we do ahead of time. I also saw that there were real challenges with coordination, with communication, with collaboration, all throughout the recovery. Oftentimes because there were so many people trying to help, so many different organizations who had their own ideas of what recovery looked like, had their own organizational cultures, had different resources, had different knowledge and experience. And trying to get all of those organizations to come together and work in the same direction was sometimes really challenging to do. So I was in New Orleans for a while. While I was there, the BP oil disaster happened along the coast. And up until 2010, my interest in disasters was pretty solely on New Orleans and Katrina. I would not have called myself a disaster buff. I was not interested in going to other disasters. I was really focused on New Orleans and on Katrina. And when BP happened, some of the nonprofits that I worked with were environmental groups, and so they were particularly interested in this event. And so I started going with them down to the coast of Louisiana. And that was the first time that I saw a response up front, right? In New Orleans, I had come once we were into recovery. But with BP, I was there for the actual response. And I noticed again, there are some differences here based on these broader demographics, based on resources that people have available to them, the coordination, the communication, the collaboration of all of these organizations, the private sector, government. This is really complicated. And there were many times throughout the Katrina recovery, throughout the BP response, that things did not go well, that things happened that I would say were not effective, were not efficient, were not equitable. And for that period of time, I kind of thought, because I didn't have other disaster experience, this is unique to New Orleans, this is something that's unique to Louisiana, notoriously corrupt political situation, tough economic situation in the state. And so that was kind of how I explained a lot of what I saw in the response and in the recovery. But then the trip that kind of made me understand that this was bigger than all of this, bigger than Louisiana, was Joplin, Missouri, after the tornado. So a group of us went up to volunteer in Joplin, and Joplin's very different than New Orleans, right? The event that had happened by tornado versus hurricane and flood versus oil spill, right? These hazards are very different from one another. And so I thought, oh, things will look different in Joplin. And yet when I got there were more similarities than there were differences. Those same challenges that I saw playing out in New Orleans, on the coast of Louisiana, were playing out in Joplin, right? And there were a lot of us that had come up from New Orleans to help with that recovery. Many of the nonprofits that had started in New Orleans after Katrina tried to expand up to Joplin. And the kind of overarching sentiment for a lot of us was, we're reinventing the wheel in Joplin. We already know what to do in recovery. We're doing it in New Orleans. We should be able to take this and apply this to Joplin, and yet they're starting from scratch. And that was really frustrating. And so on top of all of that, while I was working the BP response, if any of you have been to southeast Louisiana, like along the Butte, you will know that it's a somewhat jarring experience. It is a place in the country where you can really see the causes and consequences of climate change all right there, right? You have the oil rigs offshore, the refineries, and then you're driving on roads that at high tide can easily be flooded. You see old Highway 1 off in the distance, which is now underwater. You see the disappearing wetlands that we hear a lot about, and you see what that actually looks like for infrastructure, for the people who live there. And that was really when I started to fully understand this connection between disasters and climate change, and specifically the urgency of addressing climate change, and kind of most importantly for our purposes here, for figuring out how our disaster management system needs to change to be able to accommodate the consequences of climate change. It occurred to me that as I looked around New Orleans, Louisiana, Missouri, the Tuscaloosa, Alabama tornado, that we weren't ready for an increase in these disasters, right? We were having a hard time managing the ones we already had, let alone what we thought might be coming in the near future, and as we're now experiencing. And so to try and figure out what to do about all of this, I decided to go to graduate school. And I was very lucky to go to North Dakota State University that has an emergency management PhD program. And I went specifically to study the nonprofit sector in disasters, to figure out, we're doing all this great work. All these organizations I worked with, they're miracle workers. They are, we're up on roofs in 100-degree weather trying to fix them. We're babysitting people's kids so they can go argue about getting their electric turned back on. We're helping them fill out insurance paperwork, all of these good things that need to happen. But also, I think we need to do it even better than we're doing it. And so how do you do that? And so I went to graduate school to better understand the history of emergency management, understand the history of nonprofit involvement in disasters, to better understand our laws and policies and how that affects what is happening in the field. And I was fortunate to do a number of studies. I looked at, I talked to the people who created new nonprofits in New Orleans after Katrina, talked to them about the lifespan of their organizations. Many disaster nonprofits don't last very long. So what does that mean for the sector as a whole? I went and interviewed people who were in New Orleans volunteering on the 10-year anniversary of Katrina, and said, what made you want to, there's more recent disasters. Sandy is more recent. Why have you come from across the country to New Orleans specifically to volunteer? What motivated you to do that? And I, for my dissertation, went to Texas during the Tax Day flood in 2016, interviewed volunteers who were working, some Red Cross volunteers actually, who were working at shelters that had been opened, at various donation distribution sites, etc., to see what were the factors that were actually leading to people deciding that they wanted to volunteer during response, and how does that differ from what motivates them to volunteer in the recovery. And so these are all insights that can come from researchers, other people who have studied disaster nonprofits, disaster volunteers, that can help us look at what we're doing in the field, what you all are doing in the field, and figure out how can we make it more efficient, how can we make it even more effective so that we can meet more people's needs more quickly, which is a critical question, particularly now, as we experience this increase in disasters. The nonprofit sector, I know for myself, when I started out, I was very zeroed in on what I was doing, right? Every day I was like, okay, we gotta get this wall put up at this house, and that's what we're gonna do today. And sometimes you don't really think about the bigger picture that we're dealing with in disaster management. And I think it's really important to sometimes take a step back and think about that, and to figure out how we fit into that bigger picture. And so for disaster nonprofits broadly, you all are filling a critical part of our emergency management system, right? The model that we use, this is a little theory for you, we use something called the limited intervention model in the United States, which means government is intentionally limiting how involved they are across mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And what that means is that when a disaster happens, people experience that. They first rely on their own resources, right? They're going through their savings accounts. Hopefully they have insurance. They are maybe going to take out a loan if they're able to. But those resources often, as we know, get eaten up quite quickly, right? A lot of people don't have a lot to begin with, or the costs associated with the disaster are so extreme that it's just not enough, right? We know that people also go to their social networks. They're relying on their friends and family. Maybe they've got a rich uncle who can help out. But that also usually is not enough to help people through that. And so maybe you get a bit from FEMA, a bit from government, but really there's going to be unmet needs that many people experience. And that's where the work that you all do, the nonprofit sector, is so critical. And making sure we have a healthy nonprofit sector to fill that gap and meet those needs is, I think, one of our biggest challenges moving forward in emergency management. One of the things that I have learned in my research, and I'm sure I've talked to some people before, or we're experiencing it now, is that there is disaster fatigue generally, and that is, of course, being felt within the disaster nonprofits in terms of volunteer fatigue, deploying out again and again and again, and also in donor fatigue, right? Always having to go back, ask for more money, right? Kind of an endless ask. And so figuring out how to manage that capacity issue within the sector, and to be able to continue to do this work is, again, the challenge for us moving forward. The good news is, I think there's ways of doing this, and maybe we can talk about some of those in our Q&A or when you all have questions.
We pass the mic back and forth. Over time. All right, so I'll do about 15 minutes of Q&A and would encourage you to think of questions. Rachel and a couple of others will be moving around the room for any curiosities that you have. I've known Samantha for 11 years, and really what I've appreciated is the kind of macro level that you're talking about and kind of asking the bigger questions, right? Like, I used to love doing what I used to do at Red Cross and opening shelters and doing that work, and sometimes fail to step back and ask the bigger questions. there's a lot of big questions right now in terms of like the future of emergency management in the United States, and I'm curious how you would anticipate some of the proposed changes to federal and state emergency management impacting folks in this room, given disaster fatigue and all the things that you've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear if you've watched the news that we're going to be needing to be more reliant on nonprofits, more reliant on volunteers, and more reliant on kind of our local resources. We're going to be, our system has been stretched and at capacity for many years, even pre-COVID, going back to like the 2017 hurricane season with Harvey and Maria and Irma. And so we've been headed in this issue of having an overall capacity problem. And that's gonna change the way that mutual aid works across the country, right? The way our system is designed, we're very dependent, and Red Cross too, on sending volunteers to the places where the disasters have happened across the country. And that model worked for a long time. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to work in the same way moving forward, right? So I think a return to really building out local capacity and being able to be a little bit more on our own for longer is going to be kind of the next step here.
Absolutely. I'm curious on the work that you do that does address some of the equity observations that you had in places across the United States. I think for me, kind of watching some of the reforms at FEMA, there were times when I was like super optimistic and times I was like, ooh, wow, they missed the boat on that one. But are there elements that you see emerging from the most recent kind of reforms at FEMA that are things to look forward to? Because I know there's a lot of questions in terms of like, is this going to work? Kind of pushing responsibility to the states.
Yeah, I would say, I think maybe the positive thing here to be thinking about is that many of us in emergency management have said for a long time that we need to build out our state and local capacities. And that I think is going to now happen kind of by default. And again, I think there's like a lot of benefits to that, right? To be able to handle more on our own locally, to not have challenges associated with bringing extra people in, right? That's more money, more resources. So I think there is a way to think about expanding the role of local and state emergency management that could make for more effective responses.
Absolutely. You mentioned you're getting started in New Orleans. You're bringing a group of students to New Orleans in the next month. What are things that they're going to experience that are different than you experienced 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I teach in an emergency management undergrad program, and so I'll be bringing 24 students to New Orleans for a month to do like an immersive education experience. And I always say, if you can do emergency management in New Orleans, you can do emergency management anywhere. That is where it's most difficult. They're going to see a lot of what I saw, right? There's still parts of New Orleans where houses have not been rebuilt. The last time I worked on a house that had been affected by Katrina was 2019, so not that long ago. They'll see newer Hurricane Ida damage going down to the coast. Here's one interesting thing. We go down to Isle de Jean Charles. Does anybody know? There's news coverage of it's a small island all the way on the coast. And they call themselves America's first climate refugees. Their island has almost completely eroded. And so the community there needed to move inland. So it has taken 15 years or so. But they have built a new neighborhood called New Isle further inland, and most of the community has moved, which, as we're thinking about the future of climate change and buyout programs, and for the communities that are going to need to pick up and leave, that is the first community in the US to have done that. So that is new. There's an endless list of disaster things to see in Louisiana.
We were talking with John before the start of the conference, and obviously the New England region has been very busy. Abnormally busy, I would argue, based off of the level of disasters that you've had. And part of my kind of curiosity is how you see climate migration impacting kind of the northern regions. If there's any research that has started to emerge kind of suggesting that we're going to get busier because people are going to have to seek refuge from extreme events in the south?
Yeah, I mean, New England has traditionally kind of been thought of by academics as being one of the locations that will have fewer impacts from climate change as compared to other places, and therefore kind of logically a place where people might move. I think it's possible. I would also point out we have a lot of disasters here at this point now too, right? There was somebody from California a couple of years ago wrote an op-ed about how they were moving to Vermont to get away from the fires in California. Trade one for the other. So there, I don't think everyone's going to come to New England or anything like that. But I do think we do know from research, people are considering climate impacts, considering risk when they're thinking about where they want to live. So it's possible, which is another kind of aspect that we need to plan for as well.
Love it. I'd love to see if any audience members are thinking about pressing questions or curiosities, especially given the experience that is in the room. It was neat to see hands go up at all different levels. See one over here, one over to the right, one back.
Am I on? Okay. This is a question for the academic on the thing. You talk about a limited intervention model. Have you looked at a variety of other models and seen how well or whether or not they give insights into how things might be changed in order to be more effective? And if so, what broad statements can you feel comfortable making?
Sure. Yeah, there's effectively 3 other models that we could use, and I will tell you, unfortunately, none of them are great. So I do actually think we're kind of using the best model, probably. You can look at a model like was used in Haiti after the earthquake, right, where you have an infusion of capital coming from other countries, from NGOs. That obviously comes with some pretty massive challenges. There's another model where you just, the fully free market model where you just let everybody kind of figure it out on their own. You can imagine that if you're looking for an equitable recovery, that doesn't work quite well. So these models that are used internationally, everyone's system does look different. I think there are things that other places do that we could adopt here, right? One of the major things we know from research and experience is that in terms of helping people get back up on their feet after recovery, just giving them cash and letting them make the decisions about what they need, what's most important for them, that model is more effective than having really complicated programs where you can only use a certain amount of money for certain things, right? That doesn't always match up with people's needs. So there's definitely other things like that we can pull from other countries. I don't think any, and you have a ton of international experience too, so I don't think any country is like doing it perfectly or anything like that.
I would agree. I think the one piece I'd be curious as a follow-up question, then going to the other audience members, like part of my struggle with the emergency management system throughout any administration is trying to understand the constitutional responsibilities at the state and federal level for care and wellness of citizens. Mm-hmm. And there's a part of me that wonders if the federal government at times doesn't say, well, let's put that on the nonprofits, at the expense of donor fatigue, as we were talking about before. So I'm kind of curious how other countries are balancing that in a model that really recognizes the limitations of the philanthropic sector to solve these massive, big questions like climate change.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, this is, even in thinking about the limited intervention model, right? We've had more intervention currently in the past couple decades than we've had historically, right? We maybe going to a place where we have less intervention again from government. but we're still in the limited intervention model, right? There's still some involvement from government. So there's just a lot of room for interpretation. I think one of the single biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge for emergency management, is people not understanding what emergency management is and how it works. This is an international problem. And that's where I think, where does the nonprofit sector fit in? What can they realistically do? How does that match up with what government is doing? We're not talking across those and having kind of a realistic conversation about what our abilities are, right? We can't just say, it's fine, the Red Cross will do it. Like it's more complicated than that.
Love it. Piece of the puzzle, which is good. I saw a question in the back and a question to the right. We have fast runners. Speedy for a Friday night.
So one of the things that you pointed out, you brought up in what you were talking about, is I have been in Louisiana and in Arkansas. And the thing that really is curious for me is, I understand where to find the resources that everybody knows about. But what I'm discovering is those pop up, gonna be there just for a little bit, but I don't know how to find them. I accidentally find them. Somebody tells me, like, I'll call the city and say, hey, what are you guys doing? And we're not doing anything, but did you hear about these ministers? And they're on Facebook. And I'm like, no, I didn't hear about these ministers. Tell me more about them. And I go, and they're real. But they're only gonna be there for a very, very short time. And I don't like the idea of going to Facebook to find anybody who's real, but I did have the city tell me that. But how do I find, or how do we find, those little pockets of wonderful people that are in the community that will do face-to-face recovery with these families on short term to help them recover?
It's an amazing question. So in research, we call those emergent groups, and I think that's an appropriate name, right? These groups pop up, like you said, and oftentimes we don't even know they were there sometimes until much later somebody brings them up. There's not a perfect way of finding them. I usually find them on Facebook, I hate to tell you, and on other social media platforms. I do think sometimes local media has been able to find them. I think the best way, though, probably is just talking to people in the community and saying who else is working, who else has popped up. Usually the churches are a place where they kind of circulate. But really, I think the best thing to do is like find who the local leaders are, not the official leaders of the community, but who are the like real leaders at the local level, and talk to them. They're usually the ones, I think, who know where to find them.
Thank you.
It's brilliant. It's a tricky one for sure. Saw a question up right here.
In terms of justice and disaster response, what does that look like in practice? And then how do we as the Red Cross fit into that?
Yeah, it's a great challenging issue, right? So in my book, I talk about this concept of disaster justice, right? Coming out of social justice, climate justice, racial justice, all the justices. And disasters are a place where all of those things come together, right? And so I think a starting place for me is always the before, right? We need to be doing every single thing we possibly can to prevent these disasters, dealing with our entrenched social vulnerability in our communities. And a lot of that work can happen via preparedness. In the design of our preparedness programs, making sure that they are designed to be culturally competent, to meet the actual needs of our community. And that is the groundwork that then carries over into the response. I think that there is a need to always be thinking of who is the most vulnerable person at the shelter, and are their needs being met? And that is sometimes hard to do, it's sometimes impossible to do with the circumstances. But I am shocked in emergency management how often I encounter emergency managers who say things like, oh, I never thought that we needed to have tampons in the bathroom at the shelter, right? like really what I think is like a very basic thing. So having those conversations ahead of time and making sure that those needs are being addressed throughout responses, that's on us, right? That's on volunteers, that's on emergency managers to be doing that extra work.
I think also, just to add as a Red Cross volunteer, what always gave me great hope is that Red Cross is so committed to neutrality and impartiality, and it gets to Samantha's point around who is the most vulnerable. One of my favorite disasters, we were asked to drive roofs through a very affluent neighborhood, and it led to a very deep discussion in our little mass care group of should we or shouldn't we, and who's the most vulnerable. And at the end of the day, we were still able to provide spiritual care to those affected in the affluent neighborhood because they were vulnerable emotionally, but it was a different type of service delivery than providing feeding routes to those families. So I think in the terms of like a Red Cross service delivery plan, constantly asking the question, who's the most vulnerable? And not being afraid to ask that question during a stand-up meeting or during a planning meeting, because it becomes part of, I think, our deep committed value of serving those that are most vulnerable in humanity.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's asking who's the most vulnerable person here, but also asking who is not here. That's oftentimes the bigger injustice that's happening.
Huge. Question up front row, question.
This is actually, I think, a two-part question. One of my concerns is, as you mentioned, the frequency and the intensity of natural disasters is really frightening. And I'm just afraid that they're of such magnitude. My question is, just with the Red Cross, are the donations keeping up with the need, or are we lagging behind? That's part one of the question. Because I just see these coming with more and more, even we didn't mention fires in California, things like that. Canada's now burning down again. But it's very hard to track what is needed, and I just wondered if the donations have increased with that, or are they static, or?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Michelle is really the person to answer this for you guys specifically, but I'll just talk broadly. No, the donations are not keeping up. You know, if you can look at like the 2017 hurricane season, for example, when you compare the number of donations that came in for Hurricane Harvey, a lot of donations. Enough? I don't know. Probably could still use more, but a ton of donations came in for Hurricane Harvey. By the time we got to Maria, I mean, the most pitiful thing I've ever seen. So few donations coming in, particularly given that the need was far greater in Puerto Rico as compared to Harvey, right? And there's a whole bunch of reasons that happened. So it's not consistent from one event to another, and I would say overall, we're not keeping up.
Yeah, and the other piece I'd kind of note for those that have been in Red Cross for a long time, when I started in '93, we were a $6 billion enterprise. Blood collection was substantially higher and offset the cost of humanitarian services. So cost recovery on blood would fund a lot of the disasters across the United States. As you know, medical procedures have gotten more efficient, there's more competition with blood centers, that has shrunk substantially, which puts additional pressure on the organization. Another piece that I would say to Samantha's point is the Red Cross is predictable. It's predictable, it's repeatable. It doesn't pop up and go away. And for me, that cost of consistency cannot be impressed enough amongst the American people, that we don't just simply have the luxury of saying, we're gonna pop up a faith-based center, and if you find us on Facebook, great. If you don't, good luck. We have a congressional mandate to respond. And so I think it really kind of highlights that the scale and intensity is just far outpacing what the American public kind of sees as a moral obligation to continue the work.
So that leads into the second part of my question. And that is, as I understand the FEMA model now, as it's being told to us, is it, as you said, more local training and getting expertise at the local level, and that FEMA would provide funds for that, infrastructure and so forth. So there has to be an increase in the government support to try to overcome these events that are going on. And that is that one thing that we as citizens can do is to advocate, whatever the model is, it doesn't mean that that the cost is gonna go down. I agree, having the support locally makes a lot of sense, but local communities don't have the resources.
Yeah, exactly, right? So we need to build that state and local capacity. We also need to be building our federal capacity, right? So yeah, I mean, when people ask me like what they should do to prepare for disasters, I always tell them the number one thing you can do is vote. And that's not just federally, but locally, like who your mayor is really matters, right? They're the ones who make the decision if you're gonna evacuate. They're the ones who are deciding if you are going to have a full-time emergency manager in your community. And so, yeah, I mean, I think engaging politically as citizens is absolutely critical. That is like, it has to happen, or the changes that we might wanna see to emergency management in terms of capacity and whatnot aren't going to happen, right? And it's voting, but it's also engaging constantly, especially at the local level, right? You gotta go to your like town hall meetings and, you know, sit through the debates of should we apply for this grant to build a flood wall in town, right? Like all of those meetings that sometimes are boring, go through the budgets, argue over these things. That is a critical piece of all of this. And I do think, incidentally, disaster volunteers are some of the best people in our communities broadly to be doing that, right? You guys are people who have disaster knowledge, who understand what it means for a community to have a flood wall or not have a flood wall. And there's not really a lot of people to speak up for emergency management specifically. As I said earlier, it's really complicated. A lot of people don't understand it. They don't even know that there is a meeting about a flood wall. And so I do think that that is one thing that disaster volunteers, again, broadly, are in a particularly good position to do.
Great question. See one in the third row, fourth row. Bad counting tonight.
Thank you. Is this on? Talking about justice, I think one of the foundations of justice is inclusion. And I hear what you say about building local resources, and I agree with that. I think that is extremely important to do in every community. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily result in equity in terms of service provision. You know, what we end up with is silos. And I think that that's been the case not only, well, I know that it's happened in education, and it's happened in medicine, and it's happened all over the place. And I think in terms of disaster services, that's the risk as well. So, while building local resources, we obviously need to also focus on interdependence. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, for example, how do people access resources and things like that. You know, if you count the number of pharmaceutical advertisements during any 1 hour of television, I mute them because there's too many to listen to. It might have something to do with getting older. Well, when's the last time that we saw any advertisements or PSAs for, you know, let's get together and let's do this as a solution? Because we tend to talk about problems, but we don't talk enough about solutions. So I guess this is an advocate for inclusion in the process and interdependence to ensure a better level of equity for all.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. One of our foundational problems in emergency management, again, is that lack of knowledge, right? And our challenges with communicating not only within the field, but outside of the field to the public, to other stakeholder groups. And you're right, we need to, I'm biased. I think we need to talk about disasters more. It's like on the news a lot, but there's so much about disasters, about emergency management that the public does not know. Even basic preparedness stuff often has eluded people before you get to even any of the challenges of people actually doing those preparedness tasks. So I think you're right about that, and I think that one of these big challenges for us for the future is finding ways, not just through PSAs and commercials, but to actually integrate disasters and emergency management and like good recommendations for preparedness into popular culture. The last time there was a emergency manager in a popular disaster movie was in 1997 when Tommy Lee Jones was in the movie Volcano. And 1997, my students were not alive then. Like, we need some updated things, right? So there's a lot that can be done in terms of reaching the public in kind of newer and different ways.
Excellent point. John, and then over here.
I'd love to come back to emergency management for a second, and I'll share a story with you. I recently moved to a small town in New Hampshire. I stupidly went to one community meeting. They asked me to introduce myself, and I walked out deputy emergency manager for the town. And the reason I share that story with you is because emergency management, the profession, is part of the problem. So when you mentioned the tampons in the shelter, I giggled to myself because the emergency manager that had that shelter set up was probably a 50 to 60-year-old man that was a firefighter and or cop and had no care in the world about that concern and no education on being an emergency manager. That's half the profession right now. The other half of the professions are the Samantha Montanos of the world that come up through academia. And we're in this weird crossroads. So one of our community disaster program managers has a master's in emergency management. Two of them. Never mind. Two of them.
I got you, Phil.
So we have two that have come up in that different generation, and we're seeing a shift there. But the professionalization of emergency management as a career, as a profession, is very slowly developing. And I think the call to action to this audience, if I may, you guys mind? I guess I can do that, right? Is, what's that? Depends. So the call to action in this audience, as Red Crossers, is to get to know your local emergency managers. Because they may not know a thing about what we do. And I promise you, many of them won't. And they won't until they need us. So the opportunity to educate them and to share that information and to learn more about how well your community is prepared and share that with us so we can help them prepare better as well is huge. And with that, I'll let you answer, and I'm going to hand it to Michaela because she wants to talk preparedness with you.
Sounds good. I completely agree. I mean, across the country, most people live in a town that only has a part-time emergency manager, often a volunteer emergency manager. This is an issue across New England as well. And you're exactly right? There's a new generation of emergency managers coming in who are, like my students coming, they're so lucky. I had to stumble around New Orleans trying to figure out what FEMA was and like how any of this worked. And my students are 18 years old sitting there and it's laid out for them over the course of their first semester. And just that, having that foundational knowledge and being able to jump in, they still need the experience and the training, like don't put them in charge yet, but they are starting out at just such a different place than we have historically. And we are in sometimes a very challenging spot of trying to merge the wealth of experience that we have with the older generations and also the excitement and the specificity, let's say, of the younger generation coming in. If you also want to freak yourself out, you can also look up your local emergency management agency's budget, and you will be like, what? How can it only be that much?
All the more reason to be a good advocate. I saw possibly a question here, and then one towards the middle.
So I'll go. It wasn't preparedness, but I guess it could be deemed that. Assumptions. Actually, my question was actually geared towards, we talked about approaching disaster in a politically charged lens. But I'm curious if either in your research or your boots on the ground work, you've been seeing creative approaches to service delivery, because we're currently, we might not be directly affected right this moment, but we're already being creative in our approaches to our EM partners, fire departments, et cetera, schools. So just curious, there's been specific creative, approaches that folks are trying to do to either bridge that gap between a lack of funding or in, changing in policy.
Yeah, it's still kind of early, right? There's the one example I'm thinking of is Rhode Island. Anybody from Rhode Island here? There's some conversations going on in Rhode Island right now that I've had with local emergency managers about looking at where there's room for like local emergency management associations to become more directly involved in legislation and policy, and like, is that in emergency management? We try to stay out of politics, so this is like a little bit new. There is a lot of, but all of this starts with like that communication piece, right? Like going and talking to your elected officials right now locally is really, really important. They do not even understand the amount of money that's being lost in some places. They don't understand what's happening because this isn't what they're experts in, right? So that is a job for local emergency managers to do. However, given our previous conversation, they are probably not necessarily doing that. So that also is a space where, just like on the education piece of local officials, where Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that's starting to happen a bit.
So, gentleman towards the middle.
Yep. So no stranger to the mic. So one thing that I have not heard of tonight and is a concern is cybersecurity. It's not technically a natural disaster, but we are such a connected society, civilization now that you can have dire economic consequences for people. Like going back a little bit in time, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack disrupted fuel delivery on the East Coast. And if it went on much longer, there were going to be trucks that couldn't run, trains couldn't run, people's vehicles. That would have been very bad because you can't get food, you can't get to work, things like that. I don't think we've done a very good job of, as a society, and I don't know what the Red Cross's response to this is, of having cybersecurity literacy, the basics, and I wonder if that's an area that, if we will, not if we do, I think we will, unfortunately, have something like that happen again, we should be prepared. How would we respond to that? I'll be quiet now.
You can talk to me for a few minutes and you'll be really suicidally depressed.
Yeah.
I work in cybersecurity.
So I don't know necessarily like Red Cross specific here on cybersecurity, but generally, right, you're absolutely right. Total lack of education here. I think one of the hardest things is people, when they hear cybersecurity, they're like, oh, the computer won't work, but they aren't thinking, the next several steps down of like, well, the water supply is not gonna work, and everything's going down, right? Transportation stops, supply chains, right? All of these things just, come to a halt at a certain point. So in terms of like what actual impacts look like, that actually is very similar in many ways to various natural hazards, to the pandemic, supply chain issues, right? So there are some like unique aspects of it, but in terms of actual impacts, it is similar, right? If there's a massive cyber attack, I assume the Red Cross is responding to that. Again, like lack of education on that, lack of resources going to preparing for that, certainly.
I think the piece I'd augment, part of the work that I do with the Truman National Security Center is looking at supply chain fragility. It's a little boring for Friday night, but back in the day, Red Cross had 10 warehouses across the United States, packed with disaster supplies, right? FEMA has disaster supplies that have been dwindled down to what are called just-in-time inventory systems, right? Mirroring what's happening in the private sector, because there's this pressure to be more efficient, to be lean, as they call it in supply chain management, right? Because in theory, 99% of the time, you can get what you need within 24 hours, right? It's the anomalies, what are called the black swan events, where you're out of luck. And we saw this during the pandemic. The supply chain issues that we experienced in the United States alone is significantly challenging, all contingent upon supply chain working, FedEx, UPS, and that ecosystem. To Samantha's point, taking my Red Cross pin off, I talk to my legislative folks quite often around what's being defunded within the national security infrastructure that will impact emergency management and suppliers like the Red Cross who are out there delivering the mission. Because while we don't accept federal dollars, a large part of what we do in large-scale emergencies, the Houston floods, for example, we relied heavily on National Guard troops to put Red Crossers, and the first time in my Red Cross history, on Red Cross trucks to get them to shelters, to open shelters. And those supply chain fragilities are only getting worse as there's more and more budget pressure to quote unquote save money. And it's a tricky one, right? I'm not making it a political statement, it's more so from a humanitarian perspective. I want to make sure we can open shelters in 5-6 hours when we need it and get the supplies to where they're needed. It's a good question.
Okay, I think we're gonna take one last question. Did you still have a question, Paul? Okay, over there, you get the last.
We've had emergencies in this country for hundreds of years, and we hear all the time that we're so much better off now than we ever were with resources, with communications, with this, that, and everything else. Do you think we're doing overall a better job now than we did back then? And if not, what do you think is the main thing that has to happen to make going forward better than what it was before?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, well, let me think. So I would have said we ended last year with the best emergency management system we've ever had. I might not say that today, but a couple months ago I would have said that. We have spent multiple centuries building out an emergency management system of doing the work of learning how to respond to these events, which incidentally started with the Red Cross, right? That was our very first national repository of disaster knowledge of how to respond to these things across the country. And we have built an entire discipline that studies disasters. We have built an entire profession that is meant to manage them. We have built out the disaster nonprofit sector. We've engaged the private sector more in new ways. So yeah, I mean, I do think our system, we know more today than we ever have about how to manage disasters, right? I often think the challenges we face is not within the field a lack of knowledge. It's a lack of resources and the policy and the politics that we have to navigate. So, even though we are having this increase in events and are, in challenging times, I do think there is still hope, right? There's everybody who volunteers, even if, some of our experts are leaving FEMA or leaving these other agencies that we've come to rely on, they're still here, right? They're still gonna show up in new ways when disasters happen.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is if your variable is reductions in deaths, like success, right? Like I just think we've seen a huge move towards that. Where I get nervous as an economist is the cost, because you can't perpetually see these billion-dollar disasters. So it all depends on the variable, but it's a great point.
Yeah, and although we have internationally too had a decrease in disaster deaths, largely from warning systems and whatnot, we have to work to keep that true, right? We can lose that, which is why I think the trainings that you all are doing are so critical, right? Having these kinds of conversations, here, but also going back to your own communities, telling people you know about what you've learned here is so critical.
Awesome. Samantha, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.